So what we're looking at here is our timeline. So as we think of, we're moving through the year, we have been talking at the beginning of the session in January and February, how to build your committee. Hopefully you're not doing this by yourself. If you've learned anything from this process, it's you need people to do this with. This is so hard to do by yourself. So have a team. It's not a one-person job. So when your committee, you've met with them, there's a group of people working on this, and now there should be a plan. So in February, the February workshop, we have all of the information on how to design. So when you're thinking about sheds, irrigation, what crops you want where, how you're going to figure out what classes are growing what, you should have that idea. And now we're getting into this bottom left box here of actually building the garden. So we're going to be talking today about fencing and not fencing, irrigation, building those garden beds. What tools do you need? So your design, you can move to the next one. That you should have a design already. So that's where we are in this process. We've talked about the design. You might have a beautiful map like this super cool garden, or you might not, but there's some sort of, you have a big plan and now you're starting to build. So plan big, but start small. So we're not going to cover any of those design elements anymore. We've already talked about that. We're moving into the specifics of how to actually build your garden today. So again, our agenda, we're going to be hearing from Paul Denby, my favorite, and then growing some food at school. So different things that you can have in your garden, what design, what kind of containers basically you want to be growing in, if you're going to be growing them in beds or grow sacks in the ground. We're going to be doing giving you some information about soil, water, crop planting tools, spring planting, perennials, and then we're going to have our regional breakout rooms. So that's why we needed the poll to get you into the breakout rooms. And again, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. And one of us will be having an eye out on it. We can answer it as we go, or raise your hand in the little icon at the bottom there. So Paul Denby, I have been working with Paul for probably 7 or 8 years now. Paul is a grade 5-6 teacher at Arthur Hatton Elementary and is doing some super cool things with his class. So he started a community garden at his school, which is right in town in Kamloops on the North Shore. And they're growing tons of vegetables, selling produce at the local farmers market with his students. And him and his class are also growing microgreens and selling them to local restaurants to have funds for their class to do really cool field trips, and also goes back into the garden. So Paul, we're gonna turn it over to you now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Addie. It's a pleasure. Hello, everybody around the province. Hopefully, whatever I say today, you can gain some knowledge of some kind to take back and do whatever you guys are doing back at your schools. By no means am I an expert. It's just what I think Addie wanted me to come on, because what I've done has worked despite the massive amount of pushback that I got throughout the 5-year process that we've gone through. So the first slide you see is the top picture is what I had when I got there. So I arrived at Arthur Hatton 6 years ago on the North Shore. It's like basically an inner city school, as inner city as you get in Kamloops. So there's all these questions about, what are we going to do? How's it going to work? What's the safety of it like? Is it going to get vandalized? All the same things that you've all heard around the province from people in important positions. And we begged and pleaded and begged and pleaded, and we were able to get the approval for 3 or 4 boxes the first year. And I had, like Addie said, I had this huge, massive vision. I didn't want to start small. We were kind of forced to, but it worked out the way that it was done. So we went with boxes. We went 8x4 just because it was a simple size. I know that's a little wider than probably Marcus is going to advise, just because it's hard for kids to get in the middle, but it was a simple size because of the material that we had. I think we were just using 8-foot deck cedar boards. Cedar is obviously the way to go. It lasts the longest as far as wood go. You have to go untreated. Marcus is going to talk about that. And then you see pallets in that bottom right picture. So they were the the maintenance department was so against what we were trying to do that they said to us, when it fails, we need to be able to come and move it. So, okay, so we had to put all our boxes on pallets, which actually worked out. As you'll see later on, it worked out, but we were upset that we had to do that, but whatever. If that's what we had to do to get them in, we did it. So we had unused space. We went with material and size and went with something that would work. And then I think in the next slide, you're going to see exactly what it turned out that first year. And the first year was crazy. I remember Addie, I think these pictures might even be Addie. That middle one's probably Addie's picture, where it was like the last week of school and we just got approval, and my dad and I made these boxes and we threw them in. And we're madly trying to get the kids to take dirt and fill everything. And then I had all these plant starts that we're trying to get in. It was a crazy week. But we were so happy with the finished project that you see on the right there. The other thing we did was we covered them with lumber wrap. So we didn't use landscaping fabric like you'll see suggested a lot. We used lumber wrap because it was free. So if you go to like a Windsor Plywood or any of those places, they wrap all their wood that they transport in this stuff, and they have no use for it once it's there. And they were happy to give it away to us. So it was nice. We just poked holes in it for drainage, and away we go. I also think that Marcus is going to talk about bracing the middle of the boxes. We did that, but we actually used wire rather than like a post running through the middle. So we attached wire to the middle post of each side, and all we did was we wound that wire up so that it added strength to the middle of the box. Anything more than like 6 feet, and you're 6 feet or more, you're probably going to want to add some strength to the middle of the boxes so it doesn't push out on the sides. So we were really happy with the fact that we got it in, and now this is where the hard work sort of began. Was, okay, we have to prove this, prove that this is possible, that this is going to work long term, because everybody again was doubting us and said it wouldn't work. So the next slide. Sorry, I'm going to talk fast. If you have questions, throw them out. Marcus or whoever, jump in wherever your questions are. I'm trying to get through everything if we can. So the next slide, this is the part where it's like at the start, if you don't have irrigation, we didn't have irrigation. It was a ton of work. And we had to like not, and I say we, Addie's saying, don't try and do it by yourself. Well, I was that guy. It was like every day. I was there every day. I think I live about 20 minutes from the school. So every day in the summer, you're there making sure watering. And I was mostly hand watering with watering cans. And it sucked, but I knew that I had to prove that this would work if I wanted to increase the size of everything. I think somebody asked how deep. I think we went, each board was 4. I think we're only probably 1.5 feet, 2 feet deep on the boards, on our beds. And that varies. As you're gonna see, we don't just have these boxes. We actually have 3 different mediums we ended up with. And they all have their advantages and disadvantages. So there's nothing I would say that I've seen where I would only go with that model. There's multiple things that would work. Like I said, this just worked for us. So the other part of the planting that was important that I figured out those first couple of years was strategic planting as far as timing goes, and trying to hit the crops to be ready when we could utilize them the most. So the tomatoes are relatively straightforward. I mean, we planted those late enough and we got them in the ground that there'd be that second crop of tomatoes here in Kamloops. So we weren't worried about that, but I'm sure there's some places where you have to time it out just to hit that first crop. And now that we have corn, like we're constantly trying to time out the corn so it's ready in those first 2 weeks of school for a back to school thing. Potatoes are pretty straightforward, peppers are straightforward, but there's some things where like even carrots, maybe you're planting a crop like right at the end of the school year, trying to time it out so it's good to go when you come back in September. Because what we found was those first couple of years, there was a ton of stuff that would be ready in the middle of the summer or like mid-August, and you're like, great, what do we do with it? And so we got lucky with our pack. Our pack was able to distribute a lot of the material or a lot of the extra produce that we had, the families that needed it. And we have a lot of families at our school that need it. So we were lucky that way. But it can be overwhelming when you're hit with, and I think one of the slides later, you'll see like how much stuff we ended up producing. And when you're trying to figure out like, what am I going to do with this all? I don't want this to go to waste. It can be somewhat overwhelming if your timing isn't nailed as far as when things are going to be ready. And like even trying to get crops ready before kids go for summer break, like you're trying to get your peas to be ready, you're trying to get your lettuces and your spinaches just so you could do some things with that at the school level. That's also a big thing. And I'm sure that's a lot easier on the coast when you can get stuff in the ground well before we can here, which would make a big difference.
Paul, I just have one more. Carrie was wondering about you said it was lumber wrap on the bottom of the beds, right?
Yeah.
So is that wrapped down over the pallets to cover them, or just lining the inside of the beds? What does that look like?
Yeah, so we just put we built the outside of the box and just placed it on the pallet. And then we ran the inside, we lined the inside with the lumber wrap, as well as the inside of the cedar box itself. And that's going to preserve the cedar a little bit longer too, right? Like instead of 8 years, maybe we get 12, 15 years out of it, who knows? But we just wanted to make sure that the soil wasn't necessarily in direct contact with the cedar.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Next slide. So this is the fun part, honestly. Once we were successful and we realized like, hold on, like we can do some things with the stuff. This is pretty cool what we've been able to accomplish, what we've been able to grow. Then we were able to get out to the farmers market. We basically go every September now. And that's where all the extra stuff that we have that we're not using at the school level, all the tomatoes and peppers and whatever else we got going in the garden, that's where we sell it. And like we're able to make a decent amount of money, which goes back into the program, just like our microgreen program, it goes back into the program. So we're able to fund ourselves and then do a lot of cool stuff with that money, whether it's tools for the garden or woodwork tools to make stuff for the garden. There's a lot of different layers to it when all of a sudden we have a constant flow of cash coming through the program. It makes a big difference because now we're not going out and trying to top up grants, trying to do all that stuff and trying to figure out where the next sort of influx of cash is coming from. And then obviously at the school level, whether I think this was a salad day I see on the right, where we just grabbed whatever lettuce we could and a whole bunch of toppings from the garden and kids cut stuff up and away we go. And so we've had 2 years where we haven't obviously been able to do that the way we hope to. But getting back towards that stuff has been a lot of fun, even this year with the kids. And starting the plants. I mean, I don't think I have a picture of plant starts on here, but I've got 80 something tomato plants somewhere in my house or at school or some combination, and another 66 pepper plants and whatever it is, sort of scattered around and with that stuff, that's all stuff that the kids started. We put under the grow lights and we're either going to use it or sell it or give it away or whatever. But I think we have about 150 plants started right now that we need to find a home for in the next month or so. So if you know anybody in the Kamloops area, we have some stuff. The next slide, I think you get to see what happens when you win $15,000. So if any of you win $15,000 in like a farm or I forget what it was now, Nature's Fair,
Nature's Path, wasn't it?
Yeah, Nature's Path Organics.
Yeah, it's open right now too. So
yeah, I think they decreased it to 5. They give multiple $5,000 ones now, but we got lucky enough to win this nationwide contest for $15,000. And so because of the success of those first 3 or 4 boxes, now all of a sudden when we went back to the district, we said, listen, we've done everything you've asked us to. Those 3 or 4 boxes have crushed it. Look at all this good stuff that's happening. Look at all the educational opportunities. We've done it for 3 or 4 years. We have the money to do what we want to do. Can you do it? And then it was a 3, 4, 5 month fight. And all of a sudden, finally, they said yes after all the pressure. And you can see what happens is now all of a sudden, those little white sticks that you see in that left picture, that's like liquid gold, because that is an irrigation line that is automatic and it's set up. And so each box now has an irrigation line. That big cement pillar one they brought in, where they brought in the abutments, it's about 2 feet deep, that one. And so that's a large one above ground. And then we have another in-ground one that's not pictured here that we're really happy about too. So now we have those 3 different mediums. So we have the cement abutment, I think we increased to 6 boxes, and we have an in-ground one as well where we do our corn and our tomatoes every year. So now things are really going. And if you roll to the next slide, now you see what happens when you have all this space. And now we're at the next level where, so again, irrigation, yay, look at that. I don't have to go every single day. I can go a couple times a week. Life-changing. My family doesn't hate me nearly as much. I don't have to drag my kid there every single day like I did before. But everything's done really well with the added irrigation, less pressure on me. And now we have these, like, I mean, you see the potatoes and the tomatoes and the corn and the cucumbers and the whatever else is in the pictures. Like, it's just like, it's so much easier than it was those first 3 years, even though it's 3-4 times as much stuff. And so now we're able to really help families really donate things back into our own school, make sure the kids are eating. We use it for lunch programs, or we were using it for lunch programs before this pandemic. So it's been a lot of fun, obviously a ton of work, but once things are in place, now the idea is if I walk away sometime in the next 5 years, it's self-sustainable. Like, it's like you just need to plant stuff and weed a little bit and it goes. And it's not just a me thing. Now it's a community thing. And our goal, honestly, with the boxes, because we have so much space now, our goal has always been with the boxes to lend those out to a family every school year or every growing season. And they get to use that 4x8 box to grow whatever they want. They look after it. It's watered, but they look after it. They reap the rewards and they do whatever they want with it. That's been our goal. We just haven't been able to do that because of the complications the last couple of years. But we're hoping that this year is the first year where we can actually do what we've been trying to do with these boxes, because we don't need as much space as we have. The idea was always a community-based garden, not just for the school's use. So we're hopeful that that's going to happen. And then I think I have one more slide. In the last slide, it's all the cool stuff that can kind of come of it, right? Like, because of that influx of money, like, we're able to put down gravel everywhere. The area is fenced off. There's 3 Jora composters in the deep background of that top right picture. Like, everything is going, I can go out and buy wine barrels with the money that's coming into the program. We can cut them, the kids can sand them. We can use those in our garden space. And so this is, honestly, it's the fun part. I mean, it took 4 or 5 years to get to the fun part. And there's lots of like trials and tribulations along the way. But now that we're here, I mean, it's such a cool space. The neighbors love the idea that we've, I mean, literally increased the value of their homes in this area. They're like, man, we love it. Like, do all the things you want. They'll come over and they'll help with stuff. It's a nice community feeling. So now it's up to us to sort of adapt to whatever the next need is, whatever the next thing we have to sort of overcome, or what the next step is to make it even better and to incorporate it into our school. Probably more than I have. That's probably the next challenge for me, is to get more students outside of my small pocket involved in this program. So it's less of a me thing and more of a school-wide thing. And I think, I know I talk fast, I apologize. I think that's all I have. I don't know if anybody has any questions or anything like that, but
yeah, we have a couple minutes if anybody just wants to unmute, and you can ask Paul directly or write in the chat box. And as Serena, she's our Kamloops area animator. There's a Pro D on April 25th. So they're doing some nice skills with Chef Adam Florence from TRU and showcasing the Teach Food First and Hands on Food .ca website, and there's a registration. The $5,000 grant, I can find a link to it. It's Nature's Path Organics. It's like a cereal company or something. Yeah, it's pretty nice. Cash is helpful with gardens.
Paul, I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about, because operations, you know, it's in all school districts is an issue, in Kamloops in particular. some of the strategies you used to try and get operations support? Like, was there parents involved or stories sent?
No, that's a good question, Serena. Thank you. It's, I don't know. You have to be stubborn. Obviously, Addie knows me well. She knows how stubborn I am as a human being. So that helped. It also helped to get people on my side that were relatively maybe important or influential. So if you don't have an administrator, if you're a teacher and your administrator is not going to ride with you, they're not on your side, it's going to be a real uphill battle. It's great to get PACs on your side or parents, but the administrator is generally going to have more influence than those parties are, unless you really want to put pressure and you go the media direction, which we got close to a couple times, but we never had to sort of play that card, which was nice. And then it just, as you go along, I think you meet like-minded people, and hopefully you can find some like-minded people in the right places. But I don't know. I've never met a maintenance employee in our district that was super pumped about what we were doing, just because they felt it was going to be their job to come in and take it out. And so I'm not even, I can't even be mad at that. Like I fully understand that line of thinking, because a lot of times that's what's happened in our district. People start it and then they change schools, and all of a sudden things deteriorate, and 3 years later they're coming in and ripping everything out. So I absolutely understand that perspective. I felt like there was a way that we could do it that would be sustainable long-term, that wasn't a sort of a one-person focus, or it didn't have to be up to one person for 20 years to make something work, right? Like you don't have to be an expert to I honestly don't think you have to be an expert to maintain a space like we have now created. I think a lot of people could do it, whether you're a novice or beginner or whatever.
Paul, we have a couple of questions about vandalism. Have you had any people come and help themselves?
I'm sure we have, because we have so much produce. My thing for the helping themselves, I think it bothered me early on when we had 2 or 3 like little garden boxes. I'm like, oh man, like these carrots, like I know we had carrots pulled out a couple times before they're ready, or maybe some beets. And I'm like, man, that sucks. But when you consider we're going on 7 years, and like you can count on one hand the vandalism you've had, especially in our area. I'm telling you, like it is, I know Kamloops isn't top on most people's lists as like tough areas, but this area of Kamloops it's as inner city as it gets, right? Like it's a tough area with a high transient population. And so the fact that we haven't, I mean, knock on wood, but we haven't had the graffiti, we haven't had I think I had a couple tomato wooden posts broken last year that really bothered me, but I'm like, man, if this is the worst thing that's going to happen, it's not really that bad. Yeah, I think in some cases, if you see the thing I didn't mention earlier, it's got to be a highly visible area. I think that helps too. Like we have some, like I said, some neighbors across the street, like directly across the street from the space, and their front windows look onto the space. So yeah, there's gonna be people hanging out in the summer when there's nobody around, and yeah, we have people sleeping around the school and stuff like that in the summer quite a bit. But I think if people see that there's been care put into this area, and especially if it's around the school where you're like, man, this is a kid thing, and the signs have kid writing on them, like I think that's a tough look for anybody to come through and be like, I'm gonna mess this up, I'm gonna destroy this. Right? Maybe I don't think that's like a transient population thing. That might be more of like a anxious teenager, like I'm angry at the world kind of thing. But we've been, like I said, we've been super lucky, like a handful of times in 7 years. So
That's awesome. We have one question about deer. You don't really have deer, right?
we actually do. We have
Do you?
deer.
Oh.
Yeah, they're all around that neighborhood for some reason. They look a little bit beat up. They don't look very healthy sometimes. I don't know what they're eating, but they're not eating our stuff. No, deer are tough. So like if deer are an issue, you got to go with a deer fence, right? Like you got to have it. Is it 10 feet, I believe, or 8 feet? Does anybody know the number for? I think it's at least 8. for deer not to jump over it.
Yeah, 7 or 8 usually is what people say.
Yeah, right. So then you got to go 8 foot. But even if you have like the regular chain link like we do, and then you have like some sort of an extension when you run string or wire or something else like that, you probably get away with adding the 2 feet that way, rather than having a full 8 foot chain link fence, which then looks a little bit like a penitentiary, I would assume. But yeah, we haven't had much of a problem with deer, but I mean, we also like, our focus is our tomatoes and peppers, so it's not really crops that deer are super fond of either.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Paul. Sorry, we could go on all day. Thank you so much. So if you have any other questions, we can write it in the chat. Are you going to stick around, Paul? Are you going to head out?
No, kids got baseball. I got to go.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you.
No, you can collect them. You can email or whatever. I know whenever
Okay.
Addie mentions me, because that means I get a bunch of DMs in my
Yes.
Instagram accounts and stuff like that. I'm like, oh, Addie must have talked about me somewhere, because I don't know who this person is, and I have a DM from them.
Yep.
So whatever, anybody questions you think of later, you can post my email or whatever, Addie, or the Instagram accounts for the school, and we'll figure it out that way.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate hearing from you. And
Thank you.
say hi
Thanks, Paul.
to baseball team. Thank you. Bye.
Okay, back over to me. That was great to see that. I've heard a lot about that school, obviously from you, Addie, over the years, but I'd never actually seen what they were up to and how that came to be. So, okay, so yeah, today Paul actually went over a bunch of different things that I was going to discuss. So that's great. So I can move through some of this content a little bit quicker. So we're going to kind of move through different kind of ways that you can build and launch gardens, and just decided to focus on these 4. They're the common ones, and we're going to just kind of move through and talk about pros and cons and offer a little bit of tips for each of these different ones. And you might recognize the slide because we used it at a previous one when we were talking about garden design. So raised beds typically is just kind of a frame. It's just really a frame. It's got an open bottom. It typically means you have some soil underneath, but that you're just kind of elevating it a little bit. The pros for these are obviously weed management is great. You're not really dealing with that much. The beds are very easy to identify. Kids are not walking through the garden very often. You can do themed garden beds. So all of these things are great, especially when mapping or sharing the garden with other teachers. So it helps for just like identifying space. So that's some of the pros of it. The cons is that they can be more expensive. So in these pictures, these are 6x3 beds, which are kind of like the typical size that you'll see a lot. They're about $100 each to put these in with soil. It depends on your wood. So and the wood can allow it to last anywhere from 7 to 10 years, or if it's cedar, 10 to potentially 15 years. So you've got a lot of different options when doing that. So so when it comes to how high up you want to build it, it really is just depending on how much soil is out there. So go out and dig it up and see, do you have any soil? And if you do, if you've got a few inches, then you don't really need to build a high box up. So that's just something to keep in mind. So I showed that there was 2 on the 2 different kinds here, and the one on the right there is multiple panels. And so potentially they didn't have much soil. Maybe that's why that they built in that way. So Paul talked a little bit about bed sizes. And so just to continue on that, and he's right, if you're going to be having these beds that are longer in length than say 8 feet, you will need to cross brace. And so that's why I wanted to show these 2 pictures, is just to put a beam in there so it stops flexing or bowing of the wood. And so aside from that, long beds do benefit from putting posts in the corners in particular. It just helps hold everything together if you're going to have those long beds. When it comes to nails and screws, both of them work, but just keep in mind using nails, it's basically permanent at that point, so it's not so easy to move around. And look to have 4-inch in length. So that really can then connect the 2 pieces of wood deeply, because the corners is where boxes often come apart. I also just want to highly recommend, like Paul said, him and his dad did the job. like if you're not comfortable or don't have the tools to be building these, look for your community or parents to come and help build these. People who have woodworking skills, and in particular the tools, can do these jobs really, really quick, where it might take you a lot of time. So I always try to emphasize, reaching out to your community and asking, rather than trying to navigate this whole process, of course, unless you're excited about that idea and want to build it. So want to also encourage using wood that's as close to 2 inches as possible. A lot of the 2x4 wood that you see at Home Depot and stuff is only about 1.25 inch, and that stuff doesn't last nearly as long. So it might mean that you reach out to a local mill, or somebody who actually has a mill on their property, which is where I got these. This is a local guy, and he actually made them to the size, 8 inches high by 2 inches wide. So I was really lucky, and it was much more affordable too. Planter boxes are really just an elevated version of raised beds or raised boxes, but they often have a lip. They're very great in urban settings, like as you see, these ones will go on top of asphalt. So they're not relying on the ground below. So you're really trying to fill all the soil that your plants will need right into it. So they're going to be 18 inches, 2 feet or more. It's up to you. I like them because they offer seating around the sides. When it comes to wood choices on planter boxes, highly recommend cedar, something that lasts the longest, because you're not going to want to rebuild these every 8 to 10 years. So the cedar is the longest lasting. It does cost more, but it is definitely a good choice. And although it's not super difficult to build these, I do recommend bringing in somebody with expertise to do so. Paul mentioned this, there's just the fabric bottoms, and I wanted to mention it too. Not only is it good for extending the length of the wood that you are using, but it actually stops from soil erosion. So the soil during heavy rainfalls will actually start to slowly leak out the bottom, and this helps capture it. So that's a tip. So he was using the lumber wrap. That's a great thing to use because it's something that's going to go in the garbage, but you can also just go get landscape fabric if you want, and a staple gun just does the trick right there. Potato sacks, coffee sacks can also. It's really just anything that can kind of hold a little bit of the soil in the bottom there and prevent it from eroding. If you're building planter boxes, consider seeding. This is a garden that I built alongside my carpenter friends back many years ago, and we just decided to throw this very simple seeding in here. It really was, they built it just kind of in a couple hours. It didn't cost much or anything, and the kids loved sitting in here, kind of nestled in amongst the plants. And here's another example of a little seating arrangement. It's almost like an outdoor classroom, and it's kind of neat because when this garden, this is obviously in the spring, but by the middle of the summer or late in the season, the plants are really tall and the kids are almost hidden amongst it. And it offers them this kind of neat perspective to kind of be looking up at plants, looking up at tomato plants. So this is already, 2.5 feet off the ground. So the tomato is then, 5 feet, 6 feet. They can get really tall. So it's kind of fun. It's like the land of giants or something. So when you first build your planter boxes, they look really pretty. The wood has kind of got that reddish tinge, but eventually it starts to dull and become more of a brown. And so that's why I like to add some color. Paul kind of mentioned it in terms of vandalism. Having kids add their touch to it, signage, art murals, different things, really lets the community know this is for the kids and this is by the kids. And so it gives also kids a sense of ownership. And I really, really recommend this kind of project with kids. I think we used acrylic when we did this. And then, of course, if you're going to do that, you want to put on some sort of primer, some sort of coating so that the next rainfall doesn't wash it away. And if you go to a Home Depot or something like that, they will tell you what's the environmentally sound versions of it, kind of mineral-based oils or things like that. So yeah, it's a fun little project to do. Just a few notes on growing in wood before we move on. I already mentioned it, getting a volunteer is a great way to do it. Never use treated wood. There's chemicals in it to prolong its length of the wood. Cedar is the longest lasting wood, but it is more expensive. 2-inch thickness recommended. Height of the bed should serve a purpose. So don't just stack a whole bunch of wood out in the middle of a field. Only really do that if you need to, because it's expensive. And use long 4-inch nails and screws when attaching. So grow sacks. Grow sacks are another option. They're cheap and they're easy to install, no building experience. They range anywhere from about $6 to $20. These are 15-gallon ones, and they can grow tomatoes, squash, annual vegetables. Here's an example of like a small scale kind of farm that's in the greater Victoria area. So they were growing lettuce for their salad bar program. And here's another one that I was actually got to take part in setting up the other day. It took 6 adults 4 hours to build this entire farm from the ground up. And that's what's really exciting about it, is that you can start this little mini farm or garden so fast. The sacks weigh about 30 to 40 pounds each. And what's cool is you can move them because they have handles. So if all of a sudden one day this is not a good spot, you could just get a bunch of people together and move it. Other benefits are very little weeding management. In-ground. So benefit of in-ground is obviously that it's cheap. There's maybe more of a connection to the land itself. However, weed management is a serious issue. Sometimes students have a hard time identifying where things are planted, especially early in the year. So that can be a challenge. You got to really identify the rows a lot better. You will want to check, like, is your soil good? If you're in an urban setting, you may want to consider sending it away to be tested, just to make sure that it's not there's not a toxicity in the soil. It's pretty rare, but in urban settings, it can happen. And I just wanted to point out the bed on the right, they've created raised beds, permanent raised beds. So they usually just dig out the pathways and then fill up. And so it helps with identifying kind of the rows. So that's a good option for when you are going to choose to do just kind of in-ground planting. For breaking the ground, I just wanted to mention just a few things on that. One option is to rent or borrow or hire somebody to come in and rototill. I don't recommend rototilling very often. It's bad for soil, but it can be good for breaking the ground. For shaping the beds, I found this picture in here. I remember shaping beds in the past. It's good to just take strings and run them the length of where you want, and then to dig out the paths and kind of put it in there. It helps everyone kind of know this is where the bed is, and then you can actually move the strings over to the very next one. If you are going to be tilling, it is kind of something I recommend doing either late winter or potentially even in the fall before. It's not something you want to do right before planting. Lasagna gardening, you might have heard of. It's an option. It's also something you kind of need to start in the fall, but it's a no-till method. So you're basically laying down cardboard on top of grass or whatever, doing layers of different leaves and compost. And so it's a nice way to kind of build soil. But it does take time. You have to give it from the fall over to the spring. Silage tarps are used a lot to kill back weeds and grass in an area. They're typically laid down in the fall. So farmers use this a lot, small scale farmers. And you can see the picture there on the right is basically you pull it back, and that's after a few months of it being on there, and everything's kind of dead. And so that's a good method. And people actually use that every winter so that they can get back in there in the spring and there's no weeds. One other benefit is it actually heats up the soil, so you can get in and plant earlier for germination of your seeds. So that's kind of a nice option. I, in the past, actually just went to a local big scale farmer that did cattle, and they just gave me a bunch of this for free. So when you do in ground, though, it does have other benefits. Like you can play around with shapes, and you can put little, things in tucked in little areas. And this one's kind of shaped as a heart on the right, and these are like 2 parts of a moon. So it can be fun to do that, and it can look really pretty, but it is management because you're always kind of trying to keep the edging, back from the weeds that are always trying to come in. And so that's one of the kind of the downsides of it. Just quickly to mention this, if you're seeing that if you're wondering about your soil, or concerned, or if you're having challenges growing in it, you can always send away a sample just to see what the nutrient levels are. And so Ministry of Agriculture on their website has a few PDF documents that show all these different labs all over the province in basically every community, where you can just take a sample and send it to them, and they'll tell you, what's lacking, and then you'll know how to amend it. But for most gardens, you might not even need to if you're just adding compost each year. Some tips on soil delivery: be there when they deliver. They'll put it somewhere where you don't want it. Trust me, I've been there. Ask around for the best soil. Ask the other gardeners or other school farms, what is the best soil that you have in the area? Because you can really get some poor quality stuff if you're not knowing. Of course, make sure they dump close to the garden, and consider putting a tarp underneath. Makes for easy cleanup after. And you can also use a tarp on top before it rains, because it's very heavy to move when it's wet. And then on those days, plan a community dig day where everyone comes and shows up to move the soil. Try to have 2 wheelbarrows, at least 4 shovels, and that's kind of gets everything rolling really well. Usually 5 or 6 adults can do the job pretty quick. And of course, kids love to do it too, little buckets or Rubbermaids that they can fill. So I'm not going to go too much into this because we're going to come back to it a little bit, but it's just what Paul was saying is it's important to kind of get irrigation set up early. And if you can get it established in the ground before putting in your boxes, that's really good. You know, soaker hose and drip tape are obviously, they're great for not using a whole lot of water and putting the water right where you need it. And you can just see, this is what I'm pretty sure Paul had going on here too, but a little tap thing that comes right up out of the ground here, and it connects to these lines of the soaker hose, and then they can all be connected to timers. So this is a great one, but it does require straight lines, right? Like drip tape in particular, you're going to kind of be going straight lines, beds or rows or whatever it is, as one of the options. But it does help to get that set up kind of in the early stages. Just a quick mention on self-watering boxes for those in more of an urban setting. I know that there's some of these in Vancouver. These can be really great because they have a reservoir in the bottom and the water is essentially being pulled up into them. They're not very easy to build, so it is the kind of thing where you're probably purchasing, and you will want to water on the top in the early stages of the year because, while your plants are getting settled. For sprinklers, just any old sprinkler works actually really good, but just one tip, you want to elevate them up, because once the plants start getting high in the garden beds, the sprinkler will just spray right into the side of plants. So get them elevated up, whether it's the side-to-side sprinkler or a circular one or the impact sprayer. Just make sure it's raised up. Another option is that I've seen is people actually put them on posts, the impact sprayers, the ones that kind of go back and forth, those ones, they'll put them in the four corners of the garden, and they'll set them up on a timer that you see here in the right. It has zones. And so you'll set the timer to come on, and it'll just go to each one in the morning, and it will move around. So if you have a locked gate, that's a really great option, is to have everything set up on timers. So just a couple different ones. And then I put the split nose faucet here, which is nice to have so that you set the timer up on one and still have access to another hose for just moving around and doing basic watering. As Paul was mentioning, having a tap in the garden, so helpful for, especially if you want kids to be filling up the water buckets. If you are going to do it, make sure it's high enough up off the ground, as you see here on the picture on the left, so that kids actually can get the buckets underneath them. I've seen them not high enough, so that's the one. And consider bringing in some gravel around the base so it doesn't turn into just a big muck fest there underneath the tap. So I'm gonna now pass it. Oh, I see that there's some chats in here. Is there any questions? I can answer some of the questions right in the chat as well if you want to just take over in this section, Addie, or did you want me to speak specifically to any of them?
We were just kind of having some comments. Yeah, Rowan was sharing the pallets that not to get the heat treated ones, so they're not chemical. And I was sharing about life cycles. And then Pablo said that shallow irrigation lines get in the way when tilling the soil. So yeah, it kind of depends what your design is.
Right. Yeah, I feel like for me, I personally will till one time and that's it usually. And just to kind of establish your garden, and after that, because every time you till, you're just moving weed seeds up to the top of the soil, and you're breaking up the soil matter, which is hard on microorganisms and worms. So it's not always the best method to go with. So yeah, but that would definitely be consideration if you're gonna set up irrigation. You would not be able to till after that point, or be very cognizant of where they are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay,
yeah,
I just want to invite everybody just to do just a little stretch. It's been a long day. I only taught the last hour, but it was somehow seemed long. Okay. So when we think about plants, we say, okay, we have our beds, we have them all installed. What are we going to do? We have our irrigation, so we don't have to come every day in the summer. Everything is good, but what am I supposed to plant? So hopefully you have thought a little bit about it already, because this is the really fun part. Well, at least for me. When can I plant outside? One year I planted my peas and I was like, oh, it'll be so fun. And I put my peas out and they all rotted and died. So it was a waste of time for everybody involved. And there is definitely benefits of planting early. I mean, you get a longer growing season, but too early, it can be cold. You can kill plants, you can kill the seeds. The soil might not be warm enough. Like the air might be nice, in the air, but the soil can be a lot colder than the air. So depending on where you are in the province, it's when can I plant outside? Well, it depends. It depends where you are. It depends on what climate change is doing to our weather. So you want to have a warm stretch. You want the soil to warm up. So put your fingers in it, get outside, have your students explore how the soil is feeling. Is it thawed? Did it just snow today? Has it been a gorgeous sunny day? But what's the soil doing? Because that's where the plants are going. So it's always thinking backwards. Well, when do I want it to be ready? Hopefully you haven't missed anything. It's not too late. No matter where you are, it's not too late. You can always go buy seedlings. They are more expensive, but it'll get you any time back that maybe you didn't plant things from seed early enough. It's fine. Just take a deep breath. It's all good. You are doing okay. We have, like I said, in the last couple of workshops, we have these regional planting charts. Again, they're it's hard to make them for the entire province, but we have 3 regions. So we have a coastal one, we have an interior, and a northern one. So take these with a grain of salt, figure out what's going to work for your area. If there are local farmers that can help you perfect these dates, talk to your animators. And figure out who you can talk to about specific dates. But basically you want to have things, if you want to eat them by the end of June, you need to be planting them in the next couple of weeks so they have enough time to grow. So for spring, if you're eating the leaves, or imagine you put the seed in, it's growing the leaves. If you're going to eat the leaves, it doesn't really matter how big they get, but they need to be, they need at least a few weeks to grow. So lettuces, bok choy, kale, those kinds of things. Peas, even radish leaves aren't great, but radishes only take 21 days before they're ready. So they're pretty quick and they're kind of spicy. So it's fun for students to eat them. So be thinking, and again, it's on our charts here. So I'm not going to get into too much detail about specific crop needs. But some things you can plant in the soil, like beans, they don't like to get transplanted. So don't start beans inside and then transplant them. They don't really like that. There's all these like finicky personalities. Oh, Carrie has eaten radish leaves. I always think they're kind of hairy, but okay, if you cook them, that sounds good. They're just like a weird texture. Okay, good to know. See, look at this gardening. You can learn all the time. So when you're planting outdoors, you can be planting things that are going to need to be planted every year. Those are called annuals. You have to plant annuals annually. That's how I always tell my kids. And you either are going to be planting the seeds in the garden, or you're going to be planting seedlings in the garden. So the baby plants, you either started inside in your grow station, like you learned how to do 2 weeks ago with us, or you've purchased seedlings. So hopefully you've got a bit of a budget for your garden this year. Maybe you got a farm to school grant, fingers crossed you did, and you're able to buy seeds or the seedlings and things that you need. If you want to not have to worry about planting things every year, you can grow perennials that will come back every year. And there's rosemary, I don't have to replant it, but in Kamloops, here in Victoria, but in the interior in Kamloops, rosemary is an annual, where here there's giant bushes everywhere, which I still think is hilarious. So perennials like strawberries and rhubarb are awesome to have in your school garden because they're ready in June, and you can have strawberry rhubarb pie and smoothies, and all of these delicious things that you can have with your students. And you don't have to replant them every year. You can have fruit trees. Again, figure out when they're going to be ready. Don't be planting things that are ready in the middle of the summer when nobody's there, unless you have a plan for how you're going to harvest all those fruit and store them for September. You can also be growing native plants. We have a wonderful Learning from the Land toolkit. I'm just going to put the link in the chat here. And there's a list of plants. Oh, hang on, your slides are going wonky. Thank you. I just put the link in the chat. There's a list there of native plant resources and sample budget. So you could be it doesn't all have to be these annual crops. That's not how you need to fill the garden. So get creative, do a research project with your students. You can go to the next slide. I could talk about this all day. And again, here is our crop planning tools. So have a look at these charts, figure out what you want to be eating now, or if you're going to be having it in the fall. So if you have a new class in the fall, they wouldn't necessarily have seen how everything is growing, but there's still a lot of value in them eating fresh produce and then planting it. It's kind of backwards because they're eating it and then through the winter, and then they're planting it for the spring, maybe for your next year of class. So think about what you want and when it's going to be ready and how you're going to eat it. So there's lots of things to think about. And then on our spring harvest crop cards, on the second page of the pages, you can see, okay, are we going to be direct sowing it, or are we going to indoor sow it and transplant it? So you can work through each of these crops with your class and be thinking about, well, what part of it am I eating? Am I eating the leaves or the flowers or the roots or the fruits? And how long does that take to grow? Maybe they'll notice that leaves are ready a lot sooner because you're eating the leaves and you're not waiting for it to grow up, flower, get pollinated, and turn into a fruit, and then eat that. And you can also be thinking about how the spacing of plants is also on this sheet. So we will just go to the next page. Thank you. And so again, when you're planting with your class, you can use these crop cards. You're waiting for a warm stretch. If you have mulch, you're moving it off the, if you have leaves or anything over your beds for the winter, you can move those aside, maybe put some compost in, fertilizing. You're just loosening up the soil a little bit, not disturbing it too much unless you need to do so to plant. Laying some string so the drip tape works really well. You're planting in a straight row. Don't just hand every student a different bag of seeds and ask them to go plant it, because who knows what it's going to be. So try to facilitate it, go slow, maybe do stations, and one station is planting with you so that it's making sure things are spaced out properly. They're in straight rows, or however you're doing it. If you're doing square foot gardening, whatever your plan is, and they can be doing different activities around instead of all planting at the same time, and then it's 5 minutes is gone and all of your seeds are gone and it's all chaos and you don't know where everything is. So be thoughtful about the planting day, because I have had many chaotic planting days and I don't know where anything is, and you have to wait a couple weeks for things to appear to figure out what is growing where.
Thanks, Addie. Yeah, and just to let everyone know, we wanted to just kind of touch on this because some of you are looking to get stuff in the ground early, hoping to have a harvest before heading home for the summer holidays. But our next workshop, we will be going deeper into planting. So it'll be a more robust actual session that will be specific about planting with the kids, tips on how to plant, your long season crops and whatnot. So that'll be for the next workshop. So thanks again, Addie. Okay, so we're going to quickly just touch a little bit on some tools before we move into our breakouts. And so I just wanted to just touch on a few kind of unconventional tools that you don't always necessarily think about having in the garden, but that I think are really useful. Bypass pruners, these ones by Felco are just so useful and handy for cutting and pruning trees. I just think having a set of these away from the kids is a really good option. And a nice sturdy garden fork there can also be really good for loosening soil. It can be great for helping uproot heavy duty roots. There's a lot of purposes for those two tools. Worth investing in the good versions of them, and not to kind of point to branded ones, but Lee Valley, for example, does have a very quality garden fork that I've seen at a lot of different farms that seem to last many years. One that I don't always see used a lot is the stirrup hoe, and then there's also the collinear hoe. If you don't have these in your garden, I highly recommend looking into them. They are the ultimate weeding tools. They're all small scale farmers are using these almost exclusively for weeding in their gardens. They're great for keeping you upright. They're super duper fast. Look into them. Also, big fan of just bins. Having them, they're great for storage of your tools, your gloves, anything that the kids are bringing out. They help move around soil and compost, weeds. They're just super useful to invest in a lot of them. And then I stack them all in my little shed. Love lots of bins. Wanted to just talk quick on wheelbarrows. I think it's maybe this is kind of nerding out a lot, but I highly recommend a wheelbarrow that's kind of this nature, plastic tub. The metal ones become very heavy, and if they tip over, they can really hurt kids because they got that additional weight. Also, just a quick tip is that when choosing a tire, choose the tire without the tube inside. So it's often just kind of a rubber tire, or it's called what's the name for it, like a flat free tire. So they're a great option so that you're not busy trying to change the inner tubes, which means then you also need to buy a pump to do it. Changing those inner tubes can be a pain in the butt, so you can get them where there's no air. It's not as smooth, but it's definitely a tip worth noting. Just a little comment on sheds. I've been around a lot of schools and seen a lot of the big walk-in sheds. They're very expensive and usually you have to assemble them. They seem to attract a lot of vandalism for whatever reason. I hear this a lot. I make the case for just these smaller sheds. They're just a fraction of the cost and they really do the job. As long as they're long enough to get your rakes and shovels in, that's all you really need. And then I'll usually put the hose in there, a few Rubbermaids, and that's all you need. Even the wheelbarrow doesn't really need to go in it. I've seen most schools will just chain it off to the fence with a little lock on it. But if you have one like you see here on the right, which has like almost like a garage option, I guess you can just pull it right in. So that's kind of neat. I'd never seen that before. When it comes to locks, just consider the combination lock rather than keys, because otherwise you're just making all these keys all the time. You're always running around trying to get them back from people. People are losing them and they're reaching out to you. Whereas if you give them a number, it's so much easier. You can just text it to them when they're at the garden and they forgot their key and they're in. So I make the case for combination locks rather than the key locks. Just quickly touching on garden tools for kids, you want to consider the numbers of students and what you're doing when you start to think about purchasing. Gloves, kids like them a lot. When it comes to the trowels and rakes, choose the metal versions. I find like the plasticky ones just end up breaking all the time. Garden journals and clipboards are really fun for kids. The picture there is from a hide and go seek plant identification workshop that was really great. So they walked around with their clipboards. They used magnifying glasses and keep little journal books, notes. Also, spoons are just a really good tool to have that's super cheap for digging. It really works a lot of the time. Baggies having on site are great for collecting things. And if anyone can think of really fun tools that they like to use in the garden, please feel free to punch it into the chat as we move along. Little tip on garden jugs. The plastic ones are lighter and easier for them to carry, but they break a lot. So I think that the metal ones are a little bit of a better choice. Just tell them to only fill it up halfway if it's too heavy. Kids love to water in my experience, for those of you, so do pick up 4 to 6 of them. Though I find that they fight over it a lot, so I'll usually pair kids up and try to get 6 kids go do this and I'll get the other kids over and doing this. So just something to keep in mind when it comes to the water jugs. I like to sometimes also set up kind of like a fake rain barrel off to the side where I'll actually just fill it up if I don't have an actual reservoir of water, an area of water to come in, and I'll just let them go open it up so that they're kind of managing that instead of the hose, because I find the hose can get really hairy sometimes. So that's one of the tricks I did at schools, is I just filled up a rain barrel and then they would walk over and just slowly fill it up instead of them having the hose. I haven't had a lot of experience with these, but I've been thinking a lot about them, and they're garden measuring sticks. So actually taking like pieces of wood and marking off where they would plant things so that they can go and set it down on the ground and know, put 1 seed here, 1 seed here, 1 seed here, 1 seed here. And so I just found this a little measuring stick here. I thought it was kind of cool. And Addie and I were talking about it the other day about how you could make one for each different plant and then give it to someone, to a student, and they could walk out and put it down and then know exactly where the plant is. So I trialed that out with my son the other day and it worked really well. I just used a stick and it actually worked. So yeah, I like this idea of the garden measuring sticks. So before I move on to community engagement, okay, looks like Addie put in lots of great resources. So perfect. Okay, so we wanted to have a breakout session today with the group, and we've been doing it. In case you haven't been at any of these mentorship sessions, each time we have a little breakout, 10 to 15 minutes, and it looks like we'll probably be closer to 10 minutes for this one, maybe a little bit longer. But we just want to have people break out into sort of regional groups when possible. But if your region only has a few people, we're going to ask you to go into a different room. But we want to think about how you engage with the community, like how you ask for support, and that can be through dig days, volunteer, donations. How do you engage with the community, and how do you ask for help? Like, what are your ways of expressing your needs? So these are important questions to think about when trying to think of a school garden as a community garden. And you need to promote that success and build those relationships with the community. Think of it as a partnership when you are. And so we put up that graphic that we've been showing you a lot of time, how it kind of starts with you, but ultimately it ripples out, and that it's all about connecting as far out as possible.